Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Goethe Institute London to this online conversation with filmmaker and artist Ulrike Ottinger. My name is Maren Hobein and I'm the film programmer here at the Goethe Institute. And I'm very pleased that Ulrike Ottinger is joining us for this event, which accompanies our online screening of her film Paris Caligrammes, which is continuing until Saturday, 8th of October. And so if you haven't seen it before this event, you still have a few days to do so. And we can put the link in the chat for you to have it at hand. I just have a few remarks before I hand over to today's host, Mandy Merck. So to start with technical ones, we have about an hour for this conversation and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. And to do so, if you could put them in writing using the Q&A function. There's a button at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A, and if you click on that, a window opens and you can type them in there. And about the event, we are screening Paris Caligrammes by Ulrike Ottinger to celebrate her 80th birthday with a bit of delay, but very warmly. And also to mark a crucial step in the life of a new book in English about her work, which is called Ulrike Ottinger, Film, Art, and the Ethnographic Imagination, which is edited by Angela McRobbie, who's also joining tonight's conversation. And we think that in about a year's time, we'll be able to announce the publication. It's now sort of about to go to the publisher. And now I would like to introduce tonight's host, who very modestly sent a very short biography, Mandy Merck. So she's an emerita professor of media arts at Royal Holloway, University of London. And her latest book is Cinema's Melodramatic Celebrity, which was published this year with BFI Bloomsbury. And her next book is Downsizing the Miniature on Film. So now I hand over to you, Mandy. You're on mute, Mandy.
Okay. Thank you, Maren. Last week, the Goethe Institute screened Ulrike Ottinger's surreal chronicle of a dedicated drinkers tour of late 70s Berlin, Ticket of No Return, released in 1979. Tonight, we're meeting with Ulrike to discuss her latest film, a memoir of her own youth in another European capital, Paris Caligrammes, released in 2020. Together with Angela McRobbie, I'm very pleased to be able to engage in online discussion with Ulrike, who is speaking to us from Germany. We urge you to leave questions in the chat box for her or for us, and we will relay them to the appropriate destination. So let us, to misquote Derrida's opening of Archive Fever, begin at these two films' beginnings. The heroine of last week's film wants to obliterate her past. The maker of this week's film wants to recreate it. Ticket of No Return begins with a Pan Am jet landing at Berlin's Tegel Airport, long before both the airport and the airline company, were consigned to history. Paris Caligrammes opens less grandly, with Ulrike, age 20, setting off for France in her Rosetta bubble car, only to have it break down. What ensues is a story of living, learning, and making art as a young woman in the tumultuous Paris of 1962, to 69. Paris Caligrammes takes its title from a bookshop in the Latin Quarter called Caligrammes. The shop took its name from a book of poems of peace and war published by Guillaume Apollinaire at the end of World War I. Apollinaire came from Italy to Paris as a youth and joined the artistic circle of Picasso and Modigliani. Ulrike came from Germany to Paris as a youth and joined the artistic circles around the bookshop named after Apollinaire's book. Get it? These citations of citations lead us down a winding road of artistic influence memorialized in a film archive exhaustively recovered by Ulrike and her collaborators, an archive from which she creates a Bildungsroman, the German word for the story of a young person's search for fulfillment. This is liberally seasoned by her contemporary filming, as well as poems, artworks, and scenes from the movies. The sequence of influences winds round its wandering subject like Apollinaire's Caligrammes, whose line links and stanzas are designed to look like their subject. The German émigré Fritz Picard furnished the bookshop in the Rue de Dragon he named Caligrammes with books by authors banned by the Nazis, books that were saved from burning only to be abandoned by their fleeing owners. Its guest book from 1952 onwards records the signatures of the German surrealists Jean Arp and Max Ernst, the pacifist writer Annette Kolb, the sociologist Jakob Taube, the poet Paul Celan, the founder of the Dada movement Tristan Tzara, and the filmmaker Hans Richter. Film. We'll get to that, but not before young Ulrike, who begins as a fine artist, enrolls in the workshop of the era's leading printmaker, Johnny Friedlander. There, she initially creates lithographs of Israel, so evocative of the place that no one can believe she's never been there. She's been to Paris, we see, as the film shows us where she shivered in tiny lodgings across the Latin Quarter, warming up with the other customers in its cafes along Boulevard Saint-Germain. Few fleeting images of Sartre and Beauvoir, of Simone Signoret, of Nico before the Velvet Underground, of Juliette Greco in Le Tabou, and the drag artist Lagrange Eugène. And then, in Ulrike's own printmaking, Allen Ginsberg as Uncle Sam, as she embraced the pop art which would so influence her filmmaking, creating comic strip narratives that look like storyboards. And we'll see some examples of this very soon, as well as two other notable influences, not often remarked by those who write about her. First, the paintings of the late 19th century French symbolist Gustave Moreau, notably his series on that very queer biblical character, Salome, a fascination of Oscar Wilde in the same late 19th century period. Secondly, the engravings of Goya that Ulrike pored over in the Bibliothèque Nationale. These influences signal a much more somber tone than standard cinematic celebrations of Paris, because this isn't a celebration. Unlike so many filmmakers, Ulrike notices the poor cleaning the garbage of the boulevard cafes for something to eat. She also experiences the aftermath of the Algerian War. Ulrike arrived in Paris the year after its vicious riot police, led by Maurice Papon, the Nazi sympathizer who'd sent thousands of Jews to their deaths in the camps, massacred a still unknown number of the 30,000 Algerians demonstrating in favor of national liberation, throwing many of their bodies into the Seine. In 1961, Jean Genet premiered his play, The Screams, about TV transmissions of an Arab insurrection against an occupying army in Berlin. It wasn't until 1966 that this highly controversial drama opened in Paris at the Odeon Theatre in the Left Bank. The Odeon becomes an important place for Ottinger, and the screens a key representation of colonial history she is beginning to explore. Ulrike's ethnographic eye is often remarked upon. Now we learn something about how she developed it. Observing the Eastern influences in the design of the costumes and the screens, haunting the Musée des Colonies, now more politely renamed the Museum of African and Oceanic Art, exploring the tropical gardens that hosted the Colonial Exhibition of Paris in 1907, watching an auction of mementos from France's colonial war in Vietnam, and the demonstrations against America's colonial war in Vietnam. Ethnography leads to the cinema via the director Jean Rouch. Resistance to the Vietnam War leads to the cinema via Godard's Weekend and La Chinoise, and in the satirical vein that Ulrike would mine herself, William Klein's anti-communist superhero parody, Mr. Freedom. At the ultimate film archive, the Cinémathèque Française, she receives a sentimental education beginning with Méliès and Murnau. The street battles of May 68 take place beneath Ulrike's attic window, while her compatriot, the student leader Danny Cohn-Bendit, is derided by the right as a German Jew. The invitation to identification from this film's maker, another German Jew, is very strong. But so is her critical intelligence. The student occupiers forced out of the Sorbonne accept the invitation of her friends at the Odeon to move their headquarters into the theater. When the occupiers decide that it too is unbearably bourgeois and trash the Odeon archive, the film turns full circle. From the Nazi destruction of German literature to its tragic emulation in 1969. The Caligrammes spirals to its conclusion, and Ulrike returns to Germany. Ahead of her wait, 22 films across more than 50 years, and us. Please join the Goethe Institute, Angela McRobbie, and me in welcoming Ulrike to this online discussion. Ulrike, if you could turn off your unmute or unmute yourself, as we say.
No.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So, thank you so much, Wendy, for this wonderful introduction. And so I think people should be really prepared to ask questions. And so please do so. But I think first we have a little conversation.
Yes. Well, what I wondered is if I could ask a question, which is a very obvious and simple one, perhaps not that simple. Why did you move to Paris from your art studies in Munich?
At that time, Germany was not such an interesting place for me, because the art and world and the cultural world was so run down by the Nazis, and that it was not so interesting. Yeah, this is, I can give you an example. At that time, you couldn't see interesting films in Germany. Of course, there were some exceptions, yeah, but in general, it wasn't possible. And of course, there was an opposition, a small opposition, but, I was coming from, my parents were very interested in culture and especially in painting. So all these movements, the Surrealist movement and the Dadaist movement and the Cubism and all this was familiar to me already, yeah. And you couldn't see much of this in Germany. I always say there were exceptions. And then I was born in the French-occupied part of Germany. At that time, you had the British in the north, Americans in Bavaria and up the Rhine, and in south, in Baden, you had the French people. So we learned French in school, and we had from cultural officers, from friends, we had a lot of interesting French books, yeah. And I also had it from my parents, because my mother spoke very well French and English and some other languages. This was her profession. And so I was familiar with a lot of things, and I just wanted to leave. If it would have been possible, I would have left already with 16 or 15, yeah. But then finally I could leave, and it was fascinating for me. It was difficult also because I was very young and I didn't have any money. And at that time, the French bourgeoisie was very arrogant towards foreigners. And then, especially against the Germans after the war, you could understand this, of course, but for young women like me, it was difficult, yeah. But nevertheless, I had a lot of French friends and a lot of Spanish friends. There was also a lot of Spanish artists was coming to Paris at that time, fleeing from the Franco regime. And so it was a very lively and interesting group of young people together. And in addition, I had this wonderful, mostly elderly people at library Caligrammes, and you spoke already about this. And so this was the young people was very radical. And the people in the library Caligrammes were in another way radical, but they had another experience of history and another understanding. So sometimes this was a good corrective to my ideas. So I were living in completely different milieus, and in a way there was a kind of dialogue between these different milieus, and this was quite interesting. And I had to find my own way to get a kind of balance between it, and it formed also through the knowledge, it formed also my thinking.
You came to Paris as a printmaker and worked with Johnny Friedlander and with the other people around his circle, I take it. What drew you to printmaking as opposed to other media at that time?
No, I was a painter, but I was interested to learn especially the gravure and the etching and these techniques, yeah. And this was very interesting for me to do. But at the same time, I have done in my tiny, tiny little chambre de bonne, yeah, I have done my paintings, yeah. So therefore, the paintings were in, because the rooms were so tiny, I had, if I like to make big paintings, yeah, I had to do it in 4 pieces or in 12 pieces. Or this is what I have done, yeah. And then to see it together, I put it in the courtyard, and I went up with the elevator, yeah, to look down and to see them, yeah. So. You know, you had to improvise a lot. When you have no money, you have to find out how you can do things. Yeah.
Did you support yourself by selling your art?
Not in the beginning, absolutely not. In the beginning, I was doing what a lot of young people had done. This was au pair. It meant you went to a family, and so it was interesting. I was at the Polish ambassade, and I had to take care on the 2 boys and to bring them to school and to make breakfast for them, and then I could go to the atelier, yeah, in the morning. So, and therefore I had a small room, yeah, there in the middle of the center of Paris, what was very nice. I were always living Rive Gauche, what at the time was very lively and interesting.
Angela?
Thank you, Ulrike. And I just rewatched the film again last night and was again delighted to see it. And I was wondering, obviously you were in Paris and you were meeting and getting to know a lot of the German emigre community. You've mentioned Spanish, you've mentioned the French colleagues. I wondered if you met any of the British or the Scottish community in Paris at the time, or the painters, or I'm sure this was a period when Alex Trocchi, the Scottish writer, was living in Paris, and there was the John Calder bookshop, who was very influential. Yeah. And then you did mention the painter Kitard. So I just wondered if there was any American or British community that you also interacted with.
Yeah, no, not in the beginning. It was much later. I think it was in '67. These were some of the pop artists from Great Britain. So I met some of them, and in my gallery, sometimes they didn't have money to pay me, and then I was given some Hockneys, some other drawings, and so I was, this was very interesting for me, yeah. And I knew their paintings, of course, yeah.
Behind you, Ulrike, are 2 of your pop paintings in the period we've been discussing. Somebody is blowing a bubblegum bubble, a very large one, and getting it smacked in their face when it explodes, pop, in the painting in orange. You talked about having to make panels of paintings, small panels, and assemble them outside your room. I thought a lot about the narrative sequencing of these pop series you did, and whether it took you to film. Was there a kind of narrative drive going on that was going to bound to lead you towards moving images and stories?
You know, I started in Paris with a more, I would say, symbolistic kind of paintings. And then with the time when I had a lot also of French friends, artist friends, and also then I saw the British pop art things, and I found this very interesting, and especially the painters who worked with history, who had not only these superficial things also, it was important, but also they had a sense of history and of the meaning of things. And there I was very interested in this, so like Rauschenberg, a lot of others. And so I started to work at the same time also with literature. So I put also some texts in, and so I had a lot of different sources of inspiration. This came from daily life, it came from politics, it came also from publicities and all kinds of things. But I bought my things. This is a relatively simple painting, but I made also big triptychs you could close, like in church, but they were enormous, really big. And there there was a kind of narration. So in the form I worked was also, it was the Nouvelle Figuration, but it was also called figuration narrative, so in and this was something you could tell things. I even one day I had a gallery for 3 days, and I painted the whole room with a whole story. And it was unfortunately only for 3 days. And at the same time, I bought the music I liked, and I bought the books who had interested me and found me. And so it was quite unusual to do this, but I found it was important to show the elements from which my inspiration was coming. I was always very open with my inspiration. It's like in the film in Freak Orlando, you have a Goya episode. It's a film in 5 episodes, and one is called the Goya episodes, because the Desastres de la Guerre. So I'm really a great admirer of Goya, of Francisco Goya, and I think it's hard to find somebody who has so drastically and artistically so perfect is not the right word, but so intense, with such intensity, showed the horrors of the war. So I was very very influenced also by this, and so I tried also to work around this and to find images in the film, modern and old images, and I brought this together, and I tried to bring together three forms of misuse from power. This was Inquisition, fascism and forced psychiatry. Yeah. And so I try to find images for this.
Could you tell us a little bit about how your interest in ethnography fits into these serious political preoccupations?
Yeah. In the I was always interested in this, and already as when I was very young, and I found it always interesting to see other cultures and to have, and I liked this curiosity and also sometimes irritation of things who were different from us. And this had an enormous fascination for me. And I was becoming very curious. And in each city or each country where I was, I went to the ethnographical or ethnological museums. And I had read a lot of literature. And of course, when I was in France, you had this ethnographers who were at the same time poets. Yeah. And this is a form I'm interested. Yeah.
So it's as though you gave yourself a university education in anthropology. Your film talks about you reading Mauss and Levi-Strauss and Luis and people in between going to the appropriate museums. I wondered if Jean Rouge's films had an intake there too.
Yeah, this was later. I saw his films. This was only later when I was there. Yeah, but of course, this is visual anthropology. I think is something very important, and yeah. I went a lot to the Musée de l'Homme, where he had his office and he had his work. And I show it also in the film. Yeah, it's wonderful office with these endless steps. Yeah, where always we're running up and down. And yeah, but I read also a lot at that time. I had a big interest in Mongolia, and where I have done also a lot of films. And I had an abonnement of the Études Mongoles et Sibériennes, also then. And only very late in my age, I was able to go all these places. Yeah.
I wonder, Ulrike, if you could just say something about the making of the film itself, Paris Caligrammes. I was very interested when there was the clip of the interview with you on the radio. Maybe I can't remember exactly what year it is, but the way in which you brought together the archive material and the footage, and then the very last sequence with the guys cleaning the street and the fantastic soundtrack. So perhaps before we move to some of the other questions, you could just say something about the making of the film. It seemed to me absolutely reflective of so many of the techniques that you've subsequently developed over 40, 50 years.
Yeah. Frankly, it was the most complicated film of my whole life. Yeah. Always people is so fascinated. It's fantastic what you are doing in Siberia. And so this is the nature and you can deal with. It's difficult. But here you had to do a film. Normally when I'm doing a film, I know exactly each image yeah, and I have it in my mind. But here, yeah, I had seen for 1.5 years hundreds of films, yeah, and all kinds of films, you know, feature films, fiction films, documentaries, television interviews, all kinds of things, and all the archives, private archives, theater archives. INA, the big archive, is Bibliothèque Nationale, is also a big film archive. And it was so much, so it was always shortly before to imploding, yeah, and to so, you know, and then you had to find something, and you were thinking this would be interesting to put it here. And then when you looked and you had to find it, you found other things and said, oh, this would be interesting. You know, the montage was 2 years, yeah, and I changed so many things, yeah. To give you an example, only for the Algerian part, but the whole Algerian story is so complicated. So only this small part in the film had in the beginning 3 hours. And then for me, it wasn't complex enough. So I had to decide to put everything away and to say I get concentrated only on the effect of this political situation on my friends and on myself, and how we worked in our artistic work with this terrible experience. And so I changed so much. And then, you know, only after 1.5 years, I had a form where I was thinking, yeah, there I can go somewhere, there it works. And then in 6 weeks, I had everything together, because then everything came together. And, you know, this is very complicated. And, you know, this was a different film. For the first time, I had to say but I never have done. And I was not, you know, a lot of other filmmakers, when they are going to other countries, they are showing a lot themselves, how difficult their life is in the Siberia, or I don't know, wherever. And I've never done this, yeah. And here I had to talk about myself, but also about a whole, it's not only about myself, it is a whole generation of people and friends, the Americans, more Americans, especially the French. And this is, it was this what was we talked about and was important for us, yeah. And so I had to be serious, yeah, in really serious, and to show it, yeah, how it was, or at least how, for me, it was. But I think also for a lot of my friends, some of my friends who are still alive, a lot of them are no more alive, they saw the film. And fortunately, I was very happy that they liked the film. Yeah, so this was really good. Yeah.
You say how difficult the Algerian narrative of your film is, and the situation itself. But I take it that for you, the events around May 68 and its aftermath were also not only very difficult, but very sad for you. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about what happened then for you.
Yeah. You know, at that time, it was it was very ideological, and a lot of my friends were, or some of my friends were becoming Maoists, and they went crazy. They went just crazy, yeah. They wanted to kill everybody, and then others were becoming Marxist-Leninist, and others, and they didn't talk to each other anymore, yeah. And it were all this in the left wing, all an unbelievable separatism, yeah. And so I lost a lot of my friends because I wanted to discuss the things. And then I was told that I'm a servant of the bourgeoisie, yeah. And I said, but you have to think about a form when you like to say something important, yeah. You have to find a form, yeah. And they said the form isn't important, only the action is important. And so a lot of people were becoming very, the ideology was separated us, yeah. And this was really a pity. This was unbelievably sad. And I have to say that the most radical were becoming the most, the people who now they are bankers or have professions. So, so I'm not a very radical person, maybe aesthetically, yeah, but not in personal relationships, yeah. And I found this very difficult. This was very sad, yeah. And I were becoming overall this terrible anxieties and depression, and I left Paris at that time. Mm-hmm.
We have some questions from the wider audience today. I'd like to start with a question from Emiliano Carni, who says, the opening part of the omnibus film, 7 Women, 7 Sins, begins with your film work, Superbia, Der Stolz. Can you speak the genesis of this project overall and your amazingly imaginative contribution?
Yeah, this is a very funny project. One day, I got a call from the television, and they said, would you be interested to do the 7 Sins, one part of the 7 Sins? And while I was the first, I had the choice, and I said, yeah, I like to do Superbia, because I were just coming back from a travel to Italy, and I had seen in the Arena chapel the 7 Sins, yeah, from Giotto. And I had studied very carefully, and I liked them so much, yeah. And then I said, yeah, I'm interested. And because I was in a school with nuns, with Dominican nuns, yeah, Inquisition. Well, you know, the Dominicans were the Inquisition people, yeah. So I found it interesting, and I said, yeah, Superbia is an interesting thing. And then, for the first time, I had the painting of mine. It was in, when was it? In I think it was in 86 or 87. It was for the first time that I was thinking I had done this triptych, a kind of pop art or nouvelle figuration painting. And I say, oh, this is so interesting because I will have this triptych, and it starts with this triptych, with this painting, yeah. And then it goes out. And I have done a lot in Berlin in the industrial landscape. This was fantastic. Berlin at that time, you know, was already later, but when I arrived in Berlin in 73, this was unbelievable. Yeah, you had all these industrial places, abandoned places. And so I found one of these interesting places, and I was thinking I'm working with all the Middle Age elements, yeah, but at the same time it is today, it's playing today. And I think there for the first time, no, it's not true, but in a way it's true. I worked with documents. So I went to the television and I looked at all the documentaries about military parades, but also when people in Africa or other countries, the movements of different liberation movements or protests. And so I made this procession of Superbia, and it goes with Middle Age elements. Yeah, so in the Middle Age, there were several animals connected to Superbia, like the dragon and the camel and the eagle and so on. Yeah, and I worked with all the Middle Age elements, but then also with this modern military parades, yeah, and the idea of the big wagon was an idea of the Stolz of the Superbia, and so, and at the same time it's today, and I think you understand very well the hybris, what you say in English, hybrids of the human being. Yeah.
Well, that reply sort of chimes with our next question from Chris Berry, who says that the film makes us all think about the formative experiences of our own youth. And he wonders whether, when you were making it, did you learn new things about yourself in the process of making the film?
In which film now?
Now, Caligrammes.
Caligrammes. Yeah.
Did it teach you something about your own self?
Yeah. It's a strange situation when you try to remember what you were thinking when you were young, with the experience of somebody who has made a lot of experience later. Yeah, so it was sometimes difficult, yeah, to put yourself in this situation, but finally you can just remember how you felt at that time about certain events, and maybe you would see certain things differently today, yeah. And all this you have in mind, and all this made it also quite difficult to do this film. Yeah, this was another as a difficulty, to do this film. Did I learn something about myself? I think, because in each film you make so many it gives you so different impressions, and I learned also about a lot of documents, about things I didn't see in this complexity before. And of course, you learn always a lot when you are doing films. You have to do with a lot of people, different people, with other countries, probably with other cultures, with other meanings, and you have to deal with all this. And this is always, for me, it is unbelievable precious. Yeah.
Well, the next question very fortuitously falls along from what you've just said. The questioner, Dominic Patterson, says this. He quotes first Philippe Lejeune, writing that, quote, "Autobiography is perhaps impossible, and even surely impossible, but that doesn't prevent it from existing," end of quote. The questioner says, "I wonder if this feels true of Paris Caligrammes. Is the film as close to your fiction films as to your documentary ones?"
This is a question you are always asking yourself, of course, but it is not an autobiographical film in the sense that you are talking only about you. It is the view on a certain time also, and so it's not a classical autobiography, and therefore I think it is a possibility, and of course, maybe there is always a wish to put also your fantasies in, but the fantasy is also a part of reality. We are all. It's our dynamo. Our fantasies to go somewhere or to do something, and but I think I tried to catch the spirit of the time, and also the problems of the time. We are still dealing with them in our time.
Thank you. So in that case, what you seem to be saying is that your responsibility to history ensures that you must be, in some sense, a reliable narrator if your own story interlocks with other people's history. I'm just double checking because I remember what people said about how your pictures of Israel were so evocative that they couldn't believe you hadn't been there. But you do promise you have been to Paris, is that right? This isn't a pretense. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. Angela, would you like to ask a final question before we finish this evening's discussion?
Not really a question, but I was rather intrigued by your description, Ulrike, of being at school with the nuns. The French presence in this part of Germany in the 1950s. And I think that in itself is such a kind of rich picture of you being taught by the nuns, presumably Catholic doctrine, in Constance in the 50s. So I'd like to hear more about that the next time.
Yeah, you know, it was the only gymnasium for girls. Yeah. And so I had to go there. The nuns were all very intelligent. They had all 2 or 3 doctors, one in theology, others in the other things they had to teach. Yeah, but it was I didn't like the school at all. Yeah. And I left it earlier, and but then later on I learned a lot for myself. Yeah, and so it was difficult for me. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have one more question from our audience.
Yeah.
The questioner signs herself Susie, and she first of all thanks you for Paris Caligrammes. Thank you so much for this film and all your amazing works. Is there an autobiography by another artist that inspires you?
Mm-hmm. I have to think about this, what I have seen. I haven't seen much autobiographies. No, I wouldn't say no.
And not a written autobiography, a print memoir of some kind.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Autofiction is now apparently the dominant mode of our time.
Yeah. Yeah. I would have to think about this, but you know, I would need some time to answer this question, to think about what I have read from autobiography. No, I cannot answer this now. I'm sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, perhaps this would be the subject for another film, which could have some fantastic montages of everybody's autobiographies. Yeah. But I think today we should finish by thanking you, Ulrike, so much, both for Paris Caligrammes, for your discussion this evening, and for all your films. They have really meant a lot to us and to all the people who've watched today. And I think we have about 40 people in this audience, which is unusual for this kind of first recording of an online discussion. There will be many more because this discussion is now going to be released, streamed online for an entire week. And you can look at the Goethe Institute listings to find out how to see it again, if you like. And thank you, Angela. Thank you, Maren. Thank you, Ho. Thanks everybody at the Goethe Institute for making this possible. And good evening from me.
Thank you so much, Mandy and Angela. And thank you to the audience and your question.